Welcome to this session on Standard Dialect and Language of Instruction. Hi, I'm Garima Dalal from the Linguistic Empowerment Cell of Jawaharlal Nehru University. And in this section, we shall learn about major areas of Standard Dialect and Language of Instruction. According to Hagen, the concept of standard languages arose during the Renaissance in Europe around the invention of printing in the 15th century. The term standard has been used in sociolinguistics to refer to a prestige variety of language used within a speech community. David Crystal, the famous linguist, points out that standard languages or dialects or varieties bridge regional distinctions by providing a cohesive means of communication. In this way, an institutionalized norm can be used in language teaching. The linguistic forms or dialects which do not conform to this norm are then referred to as substandard or non-standard, though it is noteworthy that neither of the term is intended to suggest that other dialect forms lack standards in any linguistic sense. The natural development of a standard language in a speech community is known as standardization. Many of you would be wondering what a speech community is. Well, a speech community can be referred to as a set of people who have something in common linguistically: language or dialect, interaction by means of speech, a given range of varieties and rules for using them, a given range of attitudes to varieties and items. Hudson brings the difference between a language and a dialect. Historically, it was borrowed in the Renaissance as a learned word from the Greek culture. What is the difference between language and dialect? According to him, there are two ways to distinguish them. First, there is a difference in the size because language is larger than a dialect, meaning that a variety called a language contains more items than one called a dialect. Dialects with Standard English as one dialect are among many others like Yorkshire English, Indian English, etc. Therefore, the greater the size of language English. Secondly, the question of prestige plays a significant role in distinguishing a language from a dialect. A language has prestige which is lacking in a dialect. So if we apply the terms in this sense, Standard English, according to Hudson, is not a dialect at all, but a language, whereas the varieties which are not used in formal writing are dialects. Whether some variety is called a language or a dialect depends on how much prestige one thinks it has. For most people, this is a clear distinction dependent on whether it is used in formal writing. Hence, unwritten languages are referred to as dialects, especially among British culture. According to Crystal, dialect is originally a socially distinctive variety of language identified by a particular set of words and grammatical structures. Spoken dialects are usually also associated with a distinctive pronunciation or accent. Any language with a reasonably large number of speakers will develop dialects, especially if there are geographical barriers separating groups of people from each other, or if there are divisions of social class. One dialect may predominate as the official or standard form of the language, and this is the variety which may come to be written down. Dialects which will identify whether a person is from or called regional dialects. Though other terms are used, for example, local, territorial, geographical. Rural dialects are often distinguished from urban dialects. The unique complexities of the latter promoting the growth of urban dialectology. Dialects which identify where a person is in terms of social scale are called social dialects or class dialects. Dialect is also sometimes applied or used to refer to distinctive language of a particular professional group and is called or referred to as occupational dialect. Let us take the example of Sanskrit. According to Hagen, Sanskrit, which was based on a dialect spoken by Hindus living in northeast India from 1500 BCE, while the spoken dialects kept changing, Sanskrit was codified in the 4th century BCE by the linguist Panini. After that, it became the sacred medium of Hinduism and was preserved in a ritualized form which resembled the modern standards. Nevertheless, it remained the possession of a small fraction of specialists. In the 12th to 13th century, the Francian dialect became dominant and it gained the status of literary language because of both the central position of the France region and the political and cultural prestige of Paris. According to Britannica, the standard Italian came into existence in the 1860s and was adapted and accepted as written administrative and literary language. So the term dialect has generally been used to refer to a subordinate variety of a language, such as English or Hindi, which has many dialects. A regional dialect is a language variety associated with a place. For example, 7 of the major dialects of Hindi are Awadhi, Bagheli, Bhojpuri, Bundeli, Haryanvi, Kannauji, and Khadi Boli. Dialects of a language tend to differ more from one another the more remote they are from one another geographically. There exist different forms of language like regional dialects, social dialects, but from the purpose of studying and using it as a reference point for talking about other dialects, a form has to be fixed as a standard. According to Hudson, the only kind of variety which counts as proper language is a standard language. And it is a result of direct and deliberate intervention by society. This intervention, called standardization, produces a standard language, where before there were just dialects, that is, non-standard varieties. A vernacular language or a dialect, if widely accepted by the speakers for its consistent norm of writing, can be given the status of being standardized. This development process of a standard form, either written or oral, occurs over time and depends on the community involved. Social, historical, and geographical aspects can also be involved in the making of a standard language. For varieties to become standard, a series of sources can be taken into consideration, like a dictionary which is recognized and has a standardized spelling and vocabulary, or the language is given a status of an official language, or its public use in places such as courts, schools, and most importantly, its acceptance in the community. Moreover, the standard variety of language is usually the language used by the print media in the form of newspapers, magazines, and textbooks for school students. Language used in the news, broadcast on television or radio or podcast and is spoken by the majority in these disciplines also counts. People consider this variety of the language different from their respective dialects, which is used in informal setups. However, standard language is one of the many varieties which has attained prestige and popularity among the community's members. The need to establish a standard variety of language brings together the nation, including its culture, politics, and social structure. Sometimes non-standard varieties of language may be associated with low prestige, as a result of which they do not make their way to becoming a standardized language. Thus, we can say that a standard language in the making passes through different stages defined by Hudson originally in 1980. The first stage in the process involves selecting a particular variety of language to be developed into a standard language. This process is also called selection, where a particular variety of language, which can be of political or social or commercial importance, or it can even be an amalgamation of varieties, is chosen. With time, this chosen variety of language gains prestige among people. Hudson cites that in some cases the chosen language had no native speakers at all. For instance, classical Hebrew in Israel and Bhasha Indonesia in Indonesia. The next step following selection is the codification of language, where agencies write dictionaries and grammar books, so that a standard norm of a specific variety of language can be laid out for everyone to follow. Once the language's codification is in place, it becomes necessary for citizens to learn the correct form following these dictionaries and grammar books, and avoid incorrect forms while using the language to communicate primarily for writing purposes. Once the variety of language is coded, the next step is to ensure the selected variant is usable in all functions associated with central government work and writing. Hudson defines these with examples like using the selected variety for functions in parliament and law courts, in bureaucratic, educational and scientific documents of all kinds and various literature. He further adds that this includes incorporating extra-linguistic items to the variety of language, including technical words and new conventions that may be necessary by using existing forms, like formulating examination questions, writing formal letters, etc. The last stage is acceptance of this specific variety of language by the population as the national language. The standard language then serves as a unifying force for the state and symbolizes its independence from other states. However, we must not forget that all dialects and languages are equal, and labeling a particular language or dialect is a purely socio-political judgment. Globally, the standard language is the national language, which is a dialect given more prestige and power. According to the UNESCO report of 2016, studies share that nearly 40% of the children do not have access to education in a language they understand, which in turn has a negative impact on their learning. As we all know that to have an inclusive education for all children of a country, the government constantly makes efforts. This includes children whose parents are not literate or do not know English, are taught in languages like English that is not spoken in their home. This hinders their acquisition of language. Therefore, It is important to maintain equality and unbiased education. The language of instruction plays a very vital role. In the 1970s, language teaching started to lay a particular emphasis on classroom discourse. During this period, formal characteristics and social purposes of talk in school were focused. According to researchers, the teacher-student talk and ways in which language skills can be developed in classrooms came into existence. How can language skills be fostered or hindered in classrooms? To understand this, we need to understand the basic concepts in building language skills in classrooms. This contributes to our understanding of various issues involving classroom discourse and standardized language usage for students. The teacher-student talk revolves around different rules and conventions that are different from everyday conversation as documented in early research during this period. Classroom language refers to the language used by teachers and students, usually in the spoken form rather than the written. The teachers use language to inform or instruct the students. This may include the teachers telling the students what they have to do, how they have to do it, which lines to follow in the lesson, or when to follow a specific kind of instruction within the classroom. Other than this, the teacher's language is an input to the students when they are telling stories, reading a lesson, or describing a situation. Students use this language for making requests or asking for permissions, respond to questions put by the teachers, or even asking for clarifications on points they have not understood within the classroom. For students to take active participation in the classroom activities, tasks involving pair or group work are often included to encourage students to share their knowledge and develop communication skills. Such talks initiated by the teacher in the classroom can serve as a platform to provide a contextual basis for the activities included for educational purposes. Hemphill points out, repeated reference to the same topic is usually accomplished through definite reference in classroom talk, rather than through the didactic strategy is more commonly used in thematic progression in everyday informal conversation. Didactic here refers to words or expressions whose meanings are dependent on the context in which they are used. Teachers' language in the classroom is absorbed by the students and contributes to the students' language. This language is different from the language used by students in everyday conversation outside the classrooms. Usually, the interaction among students and their family members is different from the interaction among teacher, students, headmistress, student, student to student. That is, language used to communicate with members of the school community. The tone, tenure, formality of language used in formal setup in school, especially the classroom, and the language students read in the textbooks are different from the language used in everyday communication. For example, the teacher is continuously asking questions and students answer the questions that are posed to them. In such scenarios, the teachers are holding conversations. For older students, the teachers give them varied classroom discourse roles so that students can present information. The teachers often reserve themselves to use the platform to express themselves by putting up open-ended questions for eliciting students' more sophisticated language skills requiring vocabulary that is specialized for particular subject areas and grammatical forms. Following this, the teachers offer feedback to the students about the adequacy of his or her response. This is the time when the teachers can use these exchanges for several social and pedagogical purposes, like to access student background knowledge, use of transitions between topics, or even students' engagement and attention. It is noteworthy that teachers' positive evaluation can often confirm the adequacy of an answer. Therefore, classrooms present opportunities for teachers to help pupils learn academic content and also learn how to talk about such academic topics. Children in school reflect the norms and interactional practices of their families and communities. Frequent encouragement, retake. Frequent encouragement from the teachers by holding conversational floor activities for students in the classroom allows them to verbally elaborate their learnings in a much more standard language other than everyday language usage. Children start school with varying degrees of vocabulary and syntax, which often reflects the differences in family social status, parental educational levels, and cultural beliefs. To bring together students from varied backgrounds to one platform or a common platform is a challenge that all teachers need to take to propagate a more standardized form of language in their medium of instruction used in the classroom. A student needs to know what content is relevant and to a particular context, the discourse that this content should be presented in. For example, while discussing a personal response to an occurrence in one of the textbook chapters, the student must express his emotion in a particular set of words. The response to this will be different than the student's request to go out of the classroom for a glass of water. The teachers need to read the student responses and familiarize the student with appropriate responses depending on the situation's context. Talks outside the classroom do not follow a predictable sequence like the flow of talk within the classroom while discussing a lesson. Formal announcements, reading the news to the class, and sharing information about the weather, etc., require a predictable speech discourse sequence. The complexities of speech used in the classroom pose challenges to students in all schooling stages. However, as you can see on the next screen, teachers can provide support in acquiring these desired forms of a standardized language. Modeling is one of the ways teachers can help students learn how to participate in classroom talk by directly modeling the desired response or a response type. Teachers provide models to students for the kind of responses they are seeking. Hemphill suggests for second language learners or speakers of non-standard dialects, teacher support can be useful for the students, especially when introduced to new topics or initiated into new classroom speech events. Recasts or expansion of student responses is also suggested as they are instrumental in promoting academic language, vocabulary, and syntax acquisition. In learning to talk in different ways for different contexts, the students begin to understand how language can be formally used. This embodiment in language practices prompt students to produce specific language and operate within disciplines. Schooling in a language of instruction that is not the student's native language is standard in our country. Many students acquire a new language in school. They learn new vocabulary and discourse practices. Teachers simplify their talk and use gestures for students who are still acquiring the language of instruction. To clarify meaning, using multiple interactional moves can be helpful in a bilingual classroom. And alternate or mix languages in the second language classroom by code shifting or code mixing also helps bridge or repair gaps in communication. We often find students reading the text in the official language, but quickly shifting to their native language when sharing their personal views. These practices in a second language classroom can promote the acquisition of standardized language among multilingual students. We may expect standard forms in all communication contexts within the classroom. However, we cannot undermine classroom talk as a productive tool for acquiring and imbibing a standard language. For example, students may be corrected or promoted to use standard language when reading a text aloud in the classroom to their peer group. Answer in their dialect initially. With time, the students can be taken towards inculcating standard forms in their classroom usage. According to Hemphill, children's dialect patterns often extend beyond non-standard word choices and syntactic constructions targeted by the teacher by corrections and recasts. However, she cautions that with little teacher awareness regarding the differences in the discourse between the school's language and many students' language, classroom discourse may be experienced as a context for failure, misunderstanding, or shaming. For children who speak other languages or dialects at home, the language of instruction plays a vital role in familiarizing students with the standardized language, which they are likely to encounter during their academic years. Using a standardized language brings together students from different backgrounds, thereby creating a uniformity, and also opens up challenges and channels of communication between diverse groups of students. Therefore, for the purpose of education, standard language is taught in schools and is medium used by the schools to teach pupils, thereby empowering the students to access knowledge in their respective disciplines for the future. Hope this session on standard dialect and language of instruction was helpful. We learned today how dialect is different from language and how a language is standardized. Hope this session brings about clarity among these concepts and how to use language of instruction in a standardized form. Thank you.